Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hey everyone, I don't know about you, but I am coming to this podcast, this time that we have together, feeling pretty good. I mean, my kids are back at school. There was a lot of 3-day weekends for a while. 3-day weekends as a parent of toddlers is not the same as it was before kids. So there's that. There's a lot of holidays. They're back at school, and also really Q4 and then even a little bit into January was like renovation zone for me. Supposedly it was supposed to be over in like September, but then we moved back and there was just a lot of workmen at my house just finishing up small things. But I think this is the first week where there are no workmen, and I really think we're done, knock on wood. I literally just knocked on my head right now. And, oh man, this introvert in me, the highly sensitive person in me is just so thrilled. I am just giddy to have the house to myself from about 8 a.m. to about 1 p.m. most days. I just feel like, we're back in business, team. So with that in mind, let's get to today's podcast. Today, I wanted to talk about the question of what actually happens during a life coaching engagement. I wanted to speak to this because it's really one of the most common questions I get asked when I'm on a consultation with someone who's considering whether or not they'd like to work with me one-on-one. And I always say about questions like this, but I think this is such a great question. I think life coaching is a relatively new profession. Many people are not familiar with it. And a lot of coaches, to be fair, also just run their engagements in slightly different ways. So it's totally reasonable to me that you might wonder what is actually going to happen if we did work together. I think that's incredibly reasonable. Obviously, I always answer this question to the best of my abilities on my consultations. But today I thought I would also answer that question for everyone. So you don't have to wait to be on a consultation with me to have it answered. I'd like to answer this question in two ways. The first one is from a more high-level perspective. So what's the high-level arc of the coaching engagement? What happens in the beginning, the middle, the end? What's the flow of that look like from the 5,000-foot view? And then the second way I wanted to talk about it is from a more granular level. Like, what does it actually feel like to be in a coaching session with me in the weeds for those 50 minutes that we have together? What actually happens there? I'll say that there's obviously some other topics that kind of naturally overlap with this one, like, what kinds of things can coaching help with, or what's my approach to coaching, which are, again, two other questions I often get asked in consults. You will get a taste of the answers to both of those questions here, but I do go into much more detail on the question, what kinds of things can coaching help with, on episode 23 of my podcast, which is called 10 Bread and Butter Coaching Topics. So if you want to learn more about that, you can check that one out. And then I'm going to save more about my overall approach to coaching for a different podcast. But for now, let's get into this particular question, which is what actually happens during a life coaching engagement? So as I said, the first way I wanted to answer that question of what actually happens during a life coaching engagement is from the perspective of the high-level arc of my time with my clients. What happens in the beginning, the middle, and the end of a coaching engagement? So let's start with the beginning. The two big things that happen in the beginning of a coaching engagement are the intake and the coaching roadmap. The intake is just the process of me getting to know you from a bunch of different angles. Some of that is written, I send a pretty thorough self-reflection document to my new clients, which I call an introduction to you. And that's just for my clients to complete before our first session. I ask them about their bodies, their relationships, their health, their goals and fears, all kinds of different things. And I typically suggest that they take a few different sittings to complete it because there's a lot there. And I think we often have new insights if we kind of like start something and then we go away and we come back. So that's one part of the intake. The other part of the intake is that I spend the first 2 to 3 sessions asking you a bunch of different questions, a wide range of questions, using that introduction to you doc as a jumping off place, and then diving much, much deeper. And to be clear, it's not that those first 2 to 3 sessions are just chatting with me and nothing happens. Most of my clients will have new insights about themselves in those sessions, and they will start to take action between those sessions. We will typically start you off with some homework at that point. But I still view it as intake because I'm really, really focused on getting to know you from a bunch of different angles at that point. And then by session 3 or 4, I will come to our session with a proposal for a coaching roadmap. A coaching roadmap is just a written document. I typically keep it in a Google Doc so we can both edit it, which just states in words the goals of our time together. It covers how you'll feel, the skills you'll build, and what you are wanting to achieve. I come to that meeting with a draft of that coaching roadmap based both on the goals that you have explicitly stated you have. And then typically I will also edit those or adjust them or add additional goals that I think might be interesting to you and might serve you based on what you've told me. Because typically I can see, I think actually there's this other thing that's driving this problem you have. So I'll put that in too. And then we revise that draft together because it's your roadmap and I always want you to love it and feel really in alignment with it. So the coaching roadmap then, once we've both kind of signed off on it, becomes our directional document. It tells us where we're going, points us in the right direction. And then we can check in with it throughout the coaching engagement to say, which of these have we made progress on? Which of these have we not made progress on? Which of these need more attention? Does anything need to be added, subtracted, edited in any way? Because it can be a living document. We can change it over time, but we do want to have something in words that we can reference over the course of our time together. And then we're really in it. We're in the flow of coaching. We are meeting. We're having our coaching meetings. We may be in touch over email or sometimes over WhatsApp or text or voice memo between sessions. If you have anything that you want my take on or my opinions on or any coaching on, you'll have questions that you are exploring or homework you are doing between sessions. Again, it's really tailored to the person. Sometimes it's just a question to think on. Sometimes it's a much, much more involved assignment. And throughout that program, we're going to be checking in again with that roadmap to say, hey, are we going in the right direction? What needs more attention? Does anything need less attention? And then by the end of our time together, we will typically do a final check of the roadmap. Most of my clients find that they've made very significant progress on each of their purpose and outcome statements. So those are the statements that we have within the roadmap about what we're doing together and what outcomes we want. I would say many, many of my clients really knock it out of the park. Though, of course, also sometimes things have shifted over the course of our time together. Their goals have shifted. Like, maybe they came in wanting to change jobs. And then over the course of our time together, they decided that instead they wanted to make this current job really work for them. So sometimes there can be a shift and then we're hoping to achieve those new goals. So I just share that to give an overall sense of the flow and the arc of a coaching engagement. And then sort of by the end, we are also doing a more general reflection on, what really worked about this time together? What lessons did you take from it? What do you want to make sure you remember going forward? What are your next steps? What do you want to be working on? Perhaps if we're not working together going forward, what do you want to be focusing on? I will usually suggest some ideas for you. So that sort of closes out our time together and gives you a sense of both, reflecting about what you want to keep and also a sense of the path forward. So that's kind of the overall flow and arc of a coaching engagement. The second way I wanted to talk about what actually happens on a coaching engagement is by exploring what actually happens within a given coaching session. So not the high level, but the really granular level now. I think it can seem like a real black box if that's not something you've ever done before. Like, wait, what actually is going to happen? So I will say, once I started to prep this section of the podcast, I was like, oh my goodness, this could be a podcast of its own, multiple podcasts of its own. So I'll do my best to do it justice in a more concise way, at least for today. So let's imagine that you've come to a coaching session with me. You show up on our Zoom call. I will usually start by asking you how you are arriving. Probably my current clients listening to this are laughing because I really do ask that almost every time. I like to know what my clients are experiencing right this second. Like, are you coming from a super stressful work meeting and you're still physically agitated in your body? Or were you reading on the couch before this for 2 hours? So you're arriving feeling really calm and spacious, because that's going to really inform how I'm going to coach you. So I always ask about that. And then together, once I sort of know how you're arriving, we'll identify a topic for that particular coaching session. And the topic can come in a few different ways. Sometimes it is a follow-up from our last session. Like maybe you did some sort of homework. It could be a practice. It could just be like reflection on a question that I offered you to think on. And that has sparked some more evolution or insight. And we'll take that as our coaching topic and go from there. At other times, the topic is just a problem that you have been encountering recently, or something you've been frustrated about recently, or something you're just really wanting to explore. So to give a few client examples, a client recently came to me saying that he had a huge fight with his girlfriend and he wasn't sure how to improve their communication. So we talked about that. Another client recently said that she felt like she had no time in her job. She was really just feeling the lack of time this week, but she felt like she couldn't cut anything from her schedule. And so she wasn't really sure what she could do about it. So that became our coaching topic. That's the second way that a coaching topic can arise. It can just arise from whatever feels really important to you right now. A third way that we can come up with a topic is that some clients like for our topic to be really directly and explicitly tied to our coaching roadmap. So for some of my clients, we'll start the session or many sessions by kind of checking in with that roadmap. And we will very consciously pick which of those topics to tackle in this particular session. We might say, okay, so looking at those outcomes that you're shooting for, you've done a good job of improving your energy recently, but we haven't actually talked a lot about dating recently. So let's talk about dating in this session. And it's funny, those two approaches that I just mentioned, either perhaps starting from a problem that feels really currently pressing to my clients or starting from that roadmap, they might sound super different. Like one's really organic and the other's really structured. But I've actually found that typically most issues that feel important enough for you to be coached on are tied to some core developmental opportunity for you. So actually, it's all ultimately tied to the coaching roadmap. All roads typically lead to the same place, which is on the issues of the coaching roadmap getting resolved. It's more about how you like to get there. Do you like to be a bit more structured and formal, or do you like to be a bit more organic? And then the fourth and final way that we can choose a topic is that I always have a couple of topics for you in my mind for any given session. So if you feel like there's nothing urgent for you to talk about or nothing comes to mind, I'll typically always have a couple of ideas of developmental possibilities that I see for you if you'd like to hear them, if you'd like to explore them. I don't always put them out first because I want to make sure I'm really responsive to what you're wanting, but part of my prep for our session is making sure that I have some ideas for what we can talk about if there's nothing that feels pressing for you. So we pick a topic in any of those ways, and then we coach. Coaching could look like many different things, but here are a few things that happen most of the time. Other things might happen too, but these are some of the big themes. One thing that coaching can involve is understanding the problem or the yearning that you are experiencing much, much more clearly. So I'll give a real client example on this one because I just find when we make it more specific, it's always easier to understand. So I had a client who came to me really recently and she said that she was having trouble focusing. And one of the first things I did to her was just ask her a bunch of questions to really figure out, okay, in what context of your life is this actually a problem? What does a lack of focus really mean to you? What would focusing well actually look like to you? And almost always, this reveals a lot more information. Like for this particular client, it turned out that there were actually two more subtle and not exactly focusing related, but somewhat focusing related issues that were driving her problem. One was that she actually just never had more than, or not never, but typically only like once a week, she had more than about 15 or 20 minutes of free time in a given day, in a given chunk. So she just is somebody who has tons and tons of meetings. That's a really important aspect of her job. So in a given day, she typically doesn't have more than 20, maybe 15 minutes at a time. Maybe once a week, she'll have like 45 minutes, but it's just not very much time. And she does have things she has to do in between meetings that she's struggling to focus and get done. And one of the realizations we had was just that anyone would struggle to get the work that she really needs to get done in such tiny chunks of time. So she actually does need to take some action to block off some larger chunks of time at work. She does need to protect probably at least an hour a day or so for meetings. And she hadn't quite been doing that. She'd actually done it in the past in her life, but she hadn't been doing it recently. So it's focus related, but she had been sort of thinking about focus through a lens of like, why can't I just get myself to focus? When really a big piece of the problem was she just didn't really have enough time, period. So that's one of the pieces. And a second big piece that we found as I asked her all these questions was that she had kind of a cognitive fatigue problem. She couldn't focus because her brain was just exhausted from all the meetings and all the millions of things that she was doing in this really quite important role at her organization. So then we needed to talk about, how could she help her brain be less cognitively exhausted? What would cognitive rest look like if it could fit into her workday in a way that worked for her? And I'll always give my caveat here that I think I often give, which is I think all of this kind of sounds in some ways obvious when I'm summarizing it and repeating it back like this, but it really hadn't been clear to my client before we talked about it. She had been really frustrated with her focus for a long time. And I think all of us, me included, me especially, have issues like this, issues that we may feel like we're spinning on. We may feel like our wheels are spinning in the mud. We can never get traction. And when you sit with an experienced coach, I can come in and help my clients understand the contours of the problem just differently and more deeply and more actionably than they could in their own. So we can get to a very subtle understanding of the problem. So that's one piece of what we're going to do in a coaching conversation. A second part of a coaching conversation is often just letting you process your feelings a bit. If you're bringing an issue to coaching, there is likely an emotional charge to it. You might be frustrated or angry or grieving about something, even something that seems maybe more cerebral, like struggling to focus. You might think that's just an intellectual problem, but there's typically an emotional charge to it, and you may not even realize that going in. So part of my job is the art of giving you enough space to be annoyed or frustrated or sad or angry. I might help you process some of that in your body, and I might teach you new techniques to process that if that's not something you do intuitively. Because honestly, until you process a little bit of that, at least, you're not even going to be open to thinking differently or behaving differently. So part of my job is to help you get into a place where you could be open to new ideas and new implementation. But also part of the art of coaching is that we don't want to dwell there. We want to make sure we're moving on to new ideas. And, again, this is something that I have gotten very good over time at feeling into, because some people are able to move on to this new idea after, say, 5 minutes of processing. And some people might need like 40 minutes of processing. And then I'm going to throw in one key insight in there just at the right moment, just at the end. But by then, they're so open to receiving it. They've actually sort of moved on from their frustration or annoyance or stuckness, that they're able to super receive that new idea or that new model or that new insight. And it kind of blows their mind that it ended up being a super productive coaching session. So that's a second thing that we may do together. There might be some processing of whatever you're bringing. A third thing that we will almost always do in a coaching session is we'll explore your thoughts about a situation. We will figure out what your default interpretation is of something. And then I will offer you new thoughts to think instead, new models, new interpretations, or that might be something that we co-create together. Sometimes it's just a tiny adjustment in terms of how you think and interpret a situation that can totally make everything occur differently. And sometimes it's a whole new way of interpreting a situation. So to give another client example, I had a client recently who's a mother, and her adult kids have been telling her, honestly, for a long time, that she maybe gave them a bit more advice than they would prefer when they spend time together or when they talked on the phone. And this woman loves her kids. They're just incredibly, incredibly important to her. She wants to feel very close to them, but also she couldn't seem to stop herself from giving all that advice. And as we explored it, it turned out that she had an implicit belief, which was, I don't have much time, so I have to fix their problems quickly when we talk. She'd never realized she had that belief consciously until we explored it together, but when we explored it, that was her underlying thought. And then once we realized that, we could explore other options for things she could believe, other models. So one thing I offered to her was, what if your kids, what they want the most is actually a really warm, spacious place to unload all their feelings and thoughts? What if they actually don't want advice at all? And when I suggested that to her, she's so wonderful. She's such a lifelong learner and a curious person, but she was like, what, really? Like a spacious, warm place to unload their thoughts and feelings, that might be as useful to them as my, incredibly thoughtful advice. In fact, it might even be more useful. And that then led to the other thing that we did, which is then we designed an experiment, a practice that was really tailored to her and her needs. And at the time we did this coaching work, she was actually just about to visit some of her kids. Her kids, are adults. And the specific practice that I gave her was just to sit and bask in her kids, just soak them up, everything they said, like they were rays of the sun. And when she came back and came to our session, she was like, oh my God, Katie, when I started basking in them, everyone started telling me everything. Like her kids were lingering in the kitchen to talk to her rather than maybe cutting off the conversation a little shorter like they would sometimes do. She had some son-in-laws who typically didn't open up to her, but they started opening up to her. One son-in-law even told her that she suddenly seemed really calm and grounded, and they noticed. And she just felt so much more relaxed and happy doing this kind of basking thing. It was actually more relaxing for her. And then she loved that in doing this thing that was more relaxing for her, everyone also seemed to really want to talk to her. So that was kind of it within this story, a pretty natural transition to the other thing that we often do in a coaching session, which is design practices or explorations for you to do between sessions. And it's never as simple as me just saying, do this, because if you're anything like my clients or like me, you're going to have objections and fears and concerns. And, what am I going to do if they say this? And what will I do if that happens? So the reason why we do this work in this incredibly bespoke, customized way is that there's tons of time in our one-on-one sessions to go through all the tricky parts of it. So you're going to feel super comfortable that you can do this, that this practice will work for you. So that's at least 4 things that I've mentioned so far that we do in coaching sessions. We figure out more about the actual problem, the contours of it. We process feelings, we identify thought errors and offer new ones, and we design some new actions. A 5th thing that we do is help you build new skills. This can be something that we do in session, like perhaps you're trying to figure out, how to use your body to know what you want better. So in that case, I would help you practice this skill in our session together. And sometimes it's something that you'll be practicing outside of our session, like the client that I mentioned who's learning to kind of bask in her kids a bit more. But either way, we're going to make sure that you are learning how to do things that you weren't able to do before our time together. So that is just the briefest overview of what is really the entirety of my job, which is coaching. But I did want to give these specific client examples to hopefully make it all a little bit easier to kind of hold on to. And again, I think all of these things are things that sound so simple when you boil it down to these short summaries. Like, well, of course, that person's problem is so simple. Obviously, they should do that. The solution is so obvious. But again, I just want to really emphasize for each of these clients, these were genuinely new insights that were genuinely very subtle and difficult to see and difficult to implement until they were suddenly obvious in the course of our work together. And on some level, I think that might be the best summary of what coaching is, period. Like my job is to make your own kind of complex, thorny, difficult to see problems much easier to understand and then much easier to intervene in so you can actually do something about them in a lasting way. But that is an introduction to how a session with me one-on-one might feel. I will also say that I try to be really warm and welcoming and we laugh a lot, even as we also explore sometimes some really tough situations and questions and some tough feelings sometimes. So that concludes this episode of what actually happens during a coaching engagement. I hope these behind the scenes episodes are helpful. I know at least some of you out there are curious about coaching. I hope this gives you some more insight about what this can be like. I'll also say I have several previous episodes, and I know I'll have more in the future, which are interviews with some of my real clients. So that's another way of getting at that question of, what actually happens during a coaching engagement. You can do that through those real client stories. And if you are curious about working with me, I offer free hour-long consultations to just give us a chance to really get to know each other. I want to hear more about what's going on for you. I want you to have a chance to ask me any and all questions you have. And I just want us both to see whether it seems like a good fit, because I don't think my work is a good fit for everyone. So if that's of interest to you, you can check out my Work With Me page on katieseiver.com. You can reach out. We can get some things scheduled. I just want to say, as always, everyone, I'm rooting for you. You've got this. If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katieseiver.com. I'd love to meet you.